Hello, everyone, and welcome again to another episode of GaudiumetsBiz22.com Podbean podcast and YouTube video. I am the official podcaster for Communio International Catholic Review, but I have recently also become a kind of quasi-official podcaster for Ignatius Press, who keeps sending me these wonderful books and wonderful authors for me to interview. In fact, in a few weeks, I'm going to be interviewing Cardinal Wellet on his recent book from Ignatius Press, and I'm looking very much forward to that. I'm also going to be interviewing Bishop Eric Varden about his interview in Communio International Catholic Review. He's an up and comer. But anyway, I'm enough of that. I'm being rude. Our guest today is none other than the great Dr. Tracey Rowland from Australia. By the way, it's 7 o'clock in the almost 7 o'clock in the morning my time, and one of the downfalls of interviewing you crazy Australians is that you're 14 hours time difference. So it's late for you and early for me. But thank you very much for being on the show today, Dr. Rowland.
You're welcome. And I just want to put in a footnote that Eric Varden and I were at Cambridge together.
Oh, really?
So,
So you know him
yeah,
well?
I know him well. Yes.
Yeah, I always recommend his writings. So
He's just such a breath of fresh air, and the young people love him, you know.
yeah,
I
I
saw
can,
him in Norway a couple of years ago, and he collected me from the airport in his habit. And he said to me, people here think they see me in my habit and they think either this guy really is a seriously religious guy or he's a complete nutter, you know. But it's either one of those two options. And yeah, so
Well,
I think
I was flattered when I first approached him via email provided to me by Communio to do
mm,
the interview, and he not only agreed to it, but he actually said that he greatly appreciated some of my writings in various publications. So I was very humbled by that. I thought, oh, the great Bishop
mm.
Varden is reading
Yes,
my little screeds, my little scribblings, and that was really a boost for me as well because I so greatly admire him. But anyway, we are here today to discuss your latest book with Ignatius Press called Remembering George Cardinal Pell Recollections of a Great Man of the Church.
mm,
Uh, I have the book, but it's packed away since just like with my last guest, Eduardo Echeverria. Uh, I'm selling the farm, and so a lot of my books are
yes.
packed away.
Oh, okay.
So it's hidden away somewhere. Once again, I was looking for it. So remembering George Cardinal Pell, Recollections of a Great Man of the Church. Now you knew Cardinal
Mm,
Pell quite well.
mm,
In fact, I remember when you and I had lunch or dinner or whatever it was in Rome some time back. You were lamenting the fact of his passing as really a great loss to the church, and I think we can all agree with that. But this book is actually you have a wonderful introduction at the very beginning where you give your take on Cardinal Pell, glowing, of course. But the book
mm,
is actually then a collection of various other people commenting on what Cardinal Pell meant to him, which I think was a great way of getting at things. So it doesn't come across as just one woman's opinion of Cardinal Pell. It was this compendium
mm,
of glowing witness to the greatness of him. So why don't you what was the main purpose for writing this book? Was it
mm,
simply it wasn't your purpose. Here's what I'm rambling now. It's so early in the morning. Your purposes were not hagiographical. This
mm.
is not an attempt to promote his sainthood cause or anything along those lines. So, what was your main purpose in writing this book, Tracy?
I think the main purpose of writing the book was to give young Australian Catholics an understanding of the man's personality and what he had meant to so many people, because there are many people of my generation who, supported Cardinal Pell and were inspired by Cardinal Pell. And, there are whole Catholic families in Australia who were pro Cardinal Pell, but people who are now in their 20s and younger didn't live through those years. And so for
Yeah.
them, he's just a name, he's just some guy who, was unjustly imprisoned and got totally acquitted by the Australian High Court and has now died. So my concern was really that we needed something on the record for the younger generation so that they would have some sense of who this fellow was. And why is it that the name of Pell is held in such high regard by their parents and grandparents? So that was really my objective.
Yeah, because there are so many false caricatures of him that are out there. I remember I was sitting at an outdoor cafe in Rome about, I guess, almost 10 years ago now. And I was with a friend, fairly liberal, and Cardinal Pell walked by. And I said, "Oh, look, there's Cardinal Pell." And my friend rolled his eyes and said, "Oh, that right-wing nut job." That, I kind of bit my tongue because I wasn't there to
Yeah,
argue with my friend. And I said, "Oh, well, I have a different opinion." But you're right.
yeah.
Okay, so I want to start with this. Rather than going through each one of the recollections, I want
Mm,
people to get your book and to read those recollections. I'm going
mm,
to, in a sense, pick your brain and
mm,
ask you a series of questions about Cardinal Pell. So I think it does go back to something you've already alluded to, which is a bygone era of church turmoil into which Cardinal Pell entered. Why do you think this caricature of him as just this uncaring, unforgiving,
mm,
lacking in compassion, right-wing
mm,
autocrat?
mm.
How did that emerge? Is that
Yeah.
a peculiarity of an artifact of Australian Catholicism?
Not really. I think it's a combination of a number of factors. I think he was by nature a leader, and he was by nature a sportsman. You know, his father was a champion boxer, and he was a champion footballer. And he was so good at football that in Australia, the people who are behind Australian rules football, which is something huge in the national culture. When Cardinal Pell was still a schoolboy, they were trying to recruit him as a trainee A grade footballer. And so there's that dimension of him, which is quite competitive and quite alpha male-ish. He was athletic, he was tall, he was self-confident, and he was quite simply an alpha male. But that's one issue. Another issue, I think, is that he belonged to that generation that you know that they were people who understood what World War II was, and they were people who understood what hardship was, and they didn't show their emotions. It was regarded as a kind of weakness to be emoting in public. And when the Royal Commission took place in Australia into child abuse, the Cardinal was grilled for hours during that Royal Commission, but he showed no emotion. He just answered the questions. And I think that was also part of the problem that contributed to the profile of this guy who doesn't care.
Yeah, yeah.
But but in public, like some person, a public figure, I think he was a little bit like just in his understanding of his public role, not in any other way, but in his understanding of his public role. I think he was a bit like a Prince Philip figure, you know, like I'm there to be dignified. I'm there to be strong in times of national crisis. I'm there to represent the institution. One's representing the institution of the British Crown, the other is representing the institution of the Catholic Church. And, he wasn't going to blubber in public. And, he was just like this very, very strong character. But in private, he didn't blubber either. But in private, he was very warm, you know. In private, he was like a very paternal bear. There was something ursine about him, about the way he looked, the way he sounded, and the way he related to people. He was always affectionate, he was always encouraging. And another metaphor that was used to describe him in private was like a football team coach. Oh yeah, right. Well, we lost that game, but that's okay. We'll put that behind us. Let's look to the
Yeah.
next game. He was like that. So those of us who knew him personally knew him as someone who's very caring, very understanding, not at all doctrinaire, um, and and was just a great father figure for a lot of people,
Wow. That's go
including a
ahead.
lot of young priests. But the public persona was this, you know, like a big tank you know, who was there to just hold the line on Catholic teaching. And uh, yeah, he wasn't extreme. He absolutely wasn't extreme. He was totally supportive of the Second Vatican Council. He regarded Vatican II as a great thing. He wasn't what you would call a traditionalist in any sense. His attitude to the extraordinary form was, if people want that, let them have it. It's a legitimate form of the Mass. If that's what they prefer, let them have it.
Right.
But he wouldn't say it's the only possible form and that every other form is defective. He wouldn't say that. He just thought, if people want to go to Mass, um, I don't care which Mass they go to, so long as it's what is a legitimate form of the Mass, I'm happy with that.
Correct. I think you've put your finger on something very important when you talk about his generation
Mm,
and that grew up in the shadow of World War II. I'm reminded of my own father, who was in the Korean War. He's 92 now.
mhm.
And he showed no emotion in public. He was a fireman, a man's man, an alpha male, big
Yeah,
guy, just like Cardinal Pell, but showed very
yeah,
little emotion in public and came across as stern. So I had friends who would say to me, "Wow, what's it like living with your dad? He must be really
yeah,
harsh." And I would say,
yeah,
actually, my dad in person in the house is a pussycat. He's just
yeah,
charming. He's just
yeah,
affectionate and supporting and fatherly. And that I think that was just very much a part of that generation of
yeah.
men. I really
Yes,
do. And also, Cardinal, I learned this from your book. I didn't know this before, but Cardinal Pell's father owned a pub.
that's correct. Yes.
And
He
so,
owned a pub, and uh, Cardinal Pell, I think everyone says that he had this capacity to be able to talk to anyone, anyone from a member of one of the European Catholic royal families down to the most lowliest working class person who came across his path. He could just relate to people. And the general consensus is that he learned how to do that, standing behind the bar in his father's pub.
yeah, and probably learned some salty language that he probably didn't use.
Precisely. Yeah, the salty language, that was funny because a lot of people mentioned that. And then the person who was doing the copy editing at Ignatius Press was a bit concerned about the salty language. And I think in many cases where the word bastard was used, the copy editor turned it into B and then 5 or 6 dashes after that. I had to try and explain, like in Australia, calling someone a bastard, most times it's a term of affection. So,
That's right. You
yeah.
crazy bastard, that kind of thing. Yes.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
know. It's I think part of, maybe it's a part of the convict heritage of Australia, but one way we show affection for people is by kind of ragging them or teasing them or,
Yeah. Yeah.
calling them a rat bag or something. If somebody teases you like that, you've been accepted.
Yeah, I know that phenomenon well. I have that same relationship with a lot of my male friends. But anyway, let's move on from his situation, his context, and his generation. Let's move on to his. We'll talk about his prison time later. I want to move on to his role at the Vatican
Mhm.
under Pope Francis in terms of dealing with Vatican finances. what can you tell us about his experience in trying to unravel that crazy
Mm.
situation?
Look, I'm not across all the details. I just know that he was constantly facing barriers, and that while Pope Francis gave him the job of cleaning up the Vatican finances, there were certainly forces within the Curia who were constantly trying to block everything he tried to achieve.
And
And yeah.
and what is the reason for that? Was it because they were trying to hide nefarious, even sinful goings on, or is it that they all had their finger in the trough and were, getting
Hmm.
money from the Vatican finances that they knew they probably wouldn't get anymore should Cardinal Pell dig any deeper?
Yeah. Well, on one occasion, I ran into Cardinal Pellet's Casa Santa Marta, and we were literally passing in the doorway, and he said, like, "Oh, Tracy, what are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, I'm here for XYZ meeting." And he said, "Well, I'm here to try and find out what happened to a missing 20 million euro." And and certainly it was the case that some members of the Curia were totally financially corrupt, and the form that the corruption would take is something like the Vatican would have money to do a special project. Let's say it's build a nursing home or something. The person who would be employed to do the building work would be somebody's cousin, who would be paid 4 times the amount that he should have been paid for doing that building work. And there are all kinds of stories about, ways in which members of the Curia were benefiting financially from contracts that the Vatican entered into. And there was no transparency. And a major objective of Cardinal Pell was just to bring about transparency. And, he was constantly told, we don't do things that way here, and it's not good if the church has to be transparent, because that means that the enemies of the church see what we're doing. But while there might be an argument in favor of, not wanting the enemies of the church to see what projects we're funding, for example, there's also a problem if, in fact, the church's money, which comes from the people,
Right.
is actually being used to feather the nests of people who are members of the Curia. So there's definitely corruption there. And the cardinal was asking questions and investigating money trails. And when somebody can't account for, what happened to 20 million euro, then that's a bit of a problem. And
Yeah.
he was coming across that sort of thing.
And that lack of transparency has a sort of counterproductive element to it in the sense that in this internet age where, people have access to, articles and stories about the corruption of Vatican finances, what it eventually does, as we see in the example of the American Catholic Church, is it dries up donations to like Peter Penson's. I mean, under Pope Francis, there
Mm,
was a precipitous decline in
mm,
American donations to the Vatican coffers, which
yeah.
led directly to the, what is it, the current 80, $90 million operational deficit that the
Mm,
Vatican is running every year. So,
yeah.
so Cardinal Pell actually was trying to do the church a great service
Mm.
in, creating more transparent. Did he have anything to do with uncovering that $200 million debacle with the London real estate deal?
I'm not sure. I should be across stuff like that, but I'm not. I don't know whether he was personally involved in uncovering that or not.
Yeah.
Um,
Do you
yeah.
think, now I'm going to step my foot into a big,
Mm,
I'll use a Nebraskanism here from my American Midwest. I might stick my foot in a big cow pie here and feel free
mm.
to defer. Do you think that his attempts at uncovering corruption in the Vatican finances, at least partially, was led to his incarceration in Australia?
Yes, I can't prove that. I don't know anyone who can prove it, but I can certainly say that it is a widespread belief that he ended up incarcerated in Australia because there was a perfect storm of forces wanting him to be off the stage, as it were, and that the people who were corrupt in Rome colluded with people who were corrupt in Australia to bring about that end. There is certainly a widespread belief that that is so. And it's not held by sort of people who are normally conspiracy theorists, but
Yeah.
it is a widespread opinion, belief. Mhm.
But then, speaking of his incarceration, what do you think? He was clearly railroaded, which the Australian High Court eventually said, yeah,
Mm,
this is a great miscarriage of justice. There's no
mm,
way he could have done what the accusation
mm,
says that he did. It was
mm,
just impossible, time
mm,
wise,
mm,
witness wise, so on. It was just impossible. It was silly. And it was silly on its face. So the
mm,
question then becomes why, in terms of corruption,
mm,
why did the Australian court system railroad him in this fashion? Was it simply
mm.
because of anti-Catholic secularist biases against the conservative prelate?
That is one factor, but it's not the only factor. That was a powerful factor, but uh, you also need to understand that this prosecution took place in the state of Victoria, which is a bit like, I think, your California. I think
Oh, yeah.
that's probably a fair analogy. Victoria is the most politically leftist, radical, culturally Marxist state in Australia. So that's a fact. Um, Secondly, there have been many political appointments to the courts in Victoria in recent years. So people are not necessarily getting appointed because they're great lawyers, they're getting appointed because they belong to some special minority group or, you know, there's just criteria being used for appointments that is not professional competence criteria, you know.
Yeah.
That's that's another factor. A third factor is that um, in Australia there was a sense of public anger about the child abuse problem,
So a
and there
scapegoat.
there was a scapegoat. There was a need for a scapegoat, and I think many people who don't understand the internal operations of the Catholic Church felt that if Cardinal Pell was the chief Catholic in Australia, then he must have known what was going on, and therefore he must, in some sense, be complicit in the cover-ups. And even if he didn't molest a person in a sacristy after a high mass, when you've got people coming in and out of the sacristy, bringing in candles and altar cloths and all the other bits and pieces that go with a high mass, even if he didn't rape someone in a sacristy after a high mass with hundreds of people walking about, he probably deserves to be in jail because somebody deserves to be in jail because what happened was so bad that somebody needs to pay for it. And I think that was a very strong position. Other things that people need to know is that, the first trial was what we call a hung jury, and they couldn't agree, so they had to be dismissed. So we had to go through the whole thing all over again, you know. And if people who are on the jury don't know what a high mass is, if they've never been inside a cathedral, if they can't possibly imagine what a sacristy is, and how
It's not a
really
private
difficult.
space.
It's not a private space, especially not after a high mass. All of those factors. So I think it was a perfect storm of events, but understanding the culture of the state of Victoria and just how radical it is and how anti-Catholic and how much they hate, how much the elites of this state hated Cardinal Pell because he stood for all the things they were opposed to. He was anti-abortion, he was anti-euthanasia. Um, he defended the Catholic teachings very prominently. He would go out in public and just just say this is the church's teachings. It's not up to us bishops. We can't make up the teachings. Uh, the teachings come from Christ. It's not we don't have any kind of authority to change them, you know.
Yeah.
So they really hated him. Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely true in so many ways about how justice can be derailed by
Yeah.
ideology and public outrage. And the we in the United States we call that these days a new term, lawfare.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about Victoria being like California, New York City's the same way. So it's no accident. And I'm no huge fan of Donald Trump, but it's no accident that Trump was tried for this very minor crime of some sort of financial malfeasance in New York. All right,
Mm,
where I mean, it was as Alan Dershowitz said, it was a guaranteed conviction, a
mm,
guaranteed, which was just recently mitigated. Anyway, I don't want to talk about that. So, how
mm,
did to accentuate a more positive note here? How
mm.
did Cardinal Pell deal spiritually with being in prison for over a year?
Yeah. Look, I think he dealt with it extremely well. He had like a really strong faith, you know, and I think that kind of just got him through the whole situation. I didn't go and visit him when he was in prison. I knew that people were, but there were limits on how many people could visit him, and I just thought, I'm not that important. I sent him letters, but I didn't go and visit him. But people who did go and visit him just reported he was, always kind of joking and charming, and that often he knew their news before they arrived. So in one of the memoirs in the book, um, one of the priests said, and it wasn't a priest, I don't think, it was a layperson saying, there'd been a wedding in the family, and they turned up to see Cardinal Pell in prison, and they thought, they'd be telling him about the wedding, and he'd already heard about it. He'd already heard the top news about the wedding. A lot of people were writing to him and keeping him well informed. I think he would have been kind of boosted by the number of letters he received. And it was also the case that the other inmates in the prison tended to believe that he was innocent. And I think that would have helped him as well. And he was able to minister to the other prisoners pastorally, and that gave him a sense of purpose. So, all
Yeah.
up, I think he got through it quite well. But for those of us who were Catholics, sleeping in our beds at night and knowing that the Cardinal was in a jail cell, it was pretty tough times.
It was, and I didn't know him personally, but
Mm,
I was tough. I felt it was tough for me too.
mm.
Just knowing, I knew for certain that he was innocent. And
Yeah.
I sat back and I just couldn't believe that the justice system in Australia is so similar to our own here, that it
Mm.
is possible for such judicial corruption to take place. And it just created a sense of outrage within me. Uh, and so I had to believe that maybe Cardinal Pell was sitting in his jail cell feeling the same outrage. Now, he might have had moments, obviously, of outrage since
Yeah.
he was innocent, but he didn't, I mean, by all accounts, he didn't succumb to being bitter and resentful and feeling outrage.
No, not at all. But I think he was himself a little surprised that the whole system was so completely, inept. I think that surprised him. As an Australian, like I felt ashamed, really ashamed of my country. And I felt that when I traveled overseas, people no longer had the same attitude towards me. It was as if this event had changed people's attitudes to Australia and Australians. I think we'd always been regarded as people who were not kind of stupid, not gormless, not easily taken in by stupidity. Um, I think something of the convict heritage meant that in Australia, there's a tendency to judge people by what they're actually good at. not what their surname is, where they went to school, or
Yeah.
anything else. It's just like, can they do the job or not? And there's a kind of fairness about all of that. But this was really unfair, and this was really ideological, and it kind of just made us look really third world, and I felt that. Um, I still feel it. I don't think we've
Yeah.
recovered from it.
Yeah. And I think for the average American who's never been to Australia, their image of Australia was essentially drawn from Crocodile Dundee, and our
Yeah, yeah,
commercials put another shrimp on the bobby and all that kind of stuff.
yes, yeah, yeah.
And in other words, there was this sense, yeah, of Australia almost still as like a frontier country, similar to the American West, and you had all of these great sort of wonderful people forging a civilization out of
Mm,
this, and yeah, it came as a bit of a shock when we saw,
mm,
holy cow,
yeah.
this is not the reality.
It's certainly not the reality in the state of Victoria. Yeah.
Maybe elsewhere, maybe elsewhere. Okay,
Some of
so
my friends who live elsewhere in the country say, I can't believe you're still living there.
actually, I would love to visit Australia someday. Basically, because of my blog and stuff, I've developed friendships with Tom Gourlay, Philippa
Mm,
Martyr, people like that.
mm,
I'd love to come to Australia someday, but not in the near future. It's not in the cards. Anyway, so Cardinal Pell was he allowed to say mass in prison?
no, no, no.
Well, not at all, not even on Sunday.
I don't believe so. No.
Oh, that must have been a great cross for him to bear in that regard.
Mm,
Um, all right, so that's the prison experience. He gets out of prison. Where does he go after he gets out of prison?
mm. Well, he spends some time in Sydney and then he returns to Rome. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And yeah,
And what
so
did
I
he do
think,
what was he doing in Rome?
well, I think he was trying to pick up the pieces where he'd left off, but I I think he never recovered the level of authority he had um, before he came back to Australia. Not in terms of being able to influence the reforms within the Vatican. He still had enormous influence on the stage of the world, and I think he had enormous influence among fellow cardinals who continued to go to him for advice and leadership. But I don't think he was able to really make much of a kind of a dent, we would say, on
Yeah.
on influencing the situation within the Vatican Bank. And I think just recently I've heard that some of the reforms he recommended Pope Leo has actually adopted just in recent weeks.
Oh, that's very interesting.
Mm.
On a personal level, I mean, I remember I was in George Weigel's apartment. I'm not name dropping here. This is where I was. I was in George Weigel's apartment, and Cardinal Pell had just recently passed away. And I could tell George was very, very deeply moved and upset and sort of choking out his words. He said, "We just lost our quarterback."
Yeah.
And he says, "Larry, you just don't understand how important Cardinal Pell has been." So
Mm.
what was your personal reaction we were all shocked. What was your
Yeah.
personal reaction when he passed?
My personal reaction, yeah, I was walking through the streets of Soho with not Cardinal, he should be a Cardinal, with Father Alexander Sherbrooke. He's a parish priest of St. Patrick's Church in Soho. And we'd been to an event where I had spoken to some of the clergy of the Archdiocese. I'd given some lecture for them. And we were walking home from that. And uh, Father Alexander said, Tracy, I've just got to answer my phone. He said, it keeps beeping. It was in his pocket, but it was going like constantly beeping. And he says, I better answer this. And he takes it out. And then he tells me, he says, Cardinal Pell has died. And I was in a restaurant with Father Sherbrooke 2 nights before when he got a call from Cardinal Pell. And Cardinal Pell spoke to me, Father Sherbrooke said, "Oh, I'm having dinner with Tracey Rowland," and he sort of says, "Oh, let me say hello to Tracey," and like we're chatting away. So I guess my reaction was just like numbness. So I was totally kind of stunned, and then we went to into the chapel. So it was by now about 11 o'clock at night, and Father Alexander told the other people who live in the presbytery, Cardinal Pell has died. And so we had this late night mass in the church. And I think I was just really totally numb. That's really all I can say. It just seemed to be unreal. And I guess a lot of people think if he had come home to Australia or
Yes.
gone to the United States to have that operation, he would still be alive. And there are some people who say that because they know that the Italian hospitals, especially the Roman hospitals, are terrible. And there's a joke among the Catholic clergy in Rome that if you get sick, you phone Dr. Qantas. Qantas being the
Yeah,
Australian National Airline.
they're
If
like,
you
yeah.
get sick, phone Dr. Qantas. Get on the first Qantas flight out of Rome and get home to Australia to get some
Well,
proper
especially
medical
since it
treatment.
wasn't an emergency surgery, it was an elective procedure. Wasn't it a hip replacement
A
procedure?
hip replacement. Yeah.
Which is a friend of mine just had that done. He posted on Facebook picture of him sitting in the hospital bed. The procedure took in an American hospital. He said less than an hour. He was
Mm-hmm.
in and out of the OR in less than an hour, and he was already up and walking around, within a few hours. So, it's just shocking that such a routine procedure as a hip replacement surgery would have led to, I guess he threw a blood clot or something. I don't know.
Well, we don't know, and we don't know whether there was foul play. We don't know whether people
Well, I wasn't going to
wanted to have
raise
him
that
in jail.
topic, but
Look,
go
it's
ahead.
it's
Go
it's
ahead.
discussed. It's discussed. People do say um, he came out of the surgery. He spoke. I'm pretty sure he spoke to his brother when he got out, or left a message on his brother's voicemail or something. Certainly, when he first got out of the surgery, he was okay, and then he dies. Now, look, maybe like he was a man who was in his 80s, so maybe there was a blood clot or something. Alternatively, maybe there was foul play. And just as there are people who say, look, it's probable that the bad guys in Rome got together with the bad guys in Melbourne to bring the charge. Just as there are people who say that, there are people who say possibly, his death was not by natural causes, but no one has any proof.
So there was
Um,
no autopsy.
I don't think so. I've never heard of there being an
I haven't
autopsy.
heard either.
What I
So,
have heard is that somehow there's no CCTV footage during something like a 1 hour period when he
oh,
dies. Mm,
uh, now there are
mm,
also persistent rumors that I've read,
mm.
and I don't want to descend into gossip mongering here, and I want to move on to other things, but I want to address this. I mean, the persistent rumors that his body was treated with great disrespect.
Yeah, I have heard that's absolutely true.
Wow. And that only adds weight, fuel to the fire, if you will, to those theories that maybe he did meet with foul play. The fact that
Yeah,
body was treated with such contempt.
yeah,
So that's yeah. If he should have
yeah.
he should have called
He should
Dr.
have come home
Qantas.
to Australia, and I
Dr.
and
Qantas.
I think even Cardinal Dolan, if my memory is correct, said to him, "Why don't you come to the States or something?"
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, he shouldn't have had that operation in Rome.
No. Let's move on from that. I would we've described I want to describe Cardinal Pell theologically. You're a theologian. I'm a theologian.
Mhm.
And to me, I didn't know Cardinal Pell personally. I just viewed him, obviously, as a champion of orthodoxy,
Mm.
But there are varieties of orthodoxy. You've already indicated he wasn't a traditionalist in that modern sense of radical traditionalism. He certainly wasn't a liberal progressive Catholic. So he
Mm.
falls somewhere in that vague spectrum, that label of conservative
Mm.
Catholic. Was he a neocon, or as you describe yourself, a sort of European paleocon? Uh, uh,
I think he was more a neocon, definitely. Um, I think he definitely identified strongly with people like George Weigel, Richard Neuhaus. Um, he loved John Paul too. He absolutely loved John Paul too.
we all
Uh,
did.
he, we all did. Um, he believed, he is someone who believes that there was a deposit of the faith and that it's the job of bishops to hand on that same faith from one generation to another. He strongly believed that you couldn't just sort of treat the church like a big multinational corporation and the bishops as the CEOs and think that we can change the policies as one might in a secular
Yeah.
corporation. He just thought that was just so wrong. Um, he was basically a church historian, so he wasn't a theologian. He did a doctorate in church history and he
What was
knew
his
a lot.
doctorate on? I don't mean to interrupt.
Oh,
Oh, sorry, I
I
put you on
can't
the
remember
spot.
that. You
Sorry.
put me on the spot. I can't remember. It's something patristic. I know
But
that.
that's what I was getting to. What period of
It was
history?
something patristic,
Okay,
and
okay.
I know the licentiate was on Teilhard de Chardin, and he's often
Ooh,
teased about that. Um,
yeah, that's
so
interesting.
he was a church
So,
historian. Yeah.
okay, a church historian, an
Mm.
admirer of, neocons, like Richard Newhouse and so forth. That, by implication, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, means that he therefore had a certain level of belief in Western style democracy,
Yeah.
the sort of Western style republics, and
Yeah.
the institutions of that guarantee the constitutional government that guarantee human rights, freedom of religion,
All of
freedom
that.
of all of those sorts of things. Was that belief in the fundamental constitutive decency of those forms of government, was that undermined by his experience with the Australian judiciary?
I never saw any evidence that it was undermined. No, I didn't. I
What
once years before his prison experience, I once did try to explain to him the difference between a communio perspective and a neocon perspective. And he just told me he thought it was all very esoteric. And I think for him, I think for him, he basically
Uh,
couldn't care less. So long as you've got people who are going to mass, saying the rosary, and supporting official church moral teaching, as all communio scholars do, and as all the leading neocons do, what's the problem? Anything else is, it's some academic, dispute which, you know,
did he know
doesn't
Dave?
really
Did
mean.
he know David Schindler, David L.
No,
Schindler?
he
Did,
didn't. He didn't know David. No. And I think he probably knew of David,
obviously, yeah.
but I don't think they ever met. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, it's always stood out to me. I obviously, like you, have attended
Mm.
many communio meetings, many of them in Washington, D.C. and the at Catholic U, and various prelates have come and gone, even some cardinals at those conferences, but never once did I hear Cardinal Pell's name mentioned, or never once
Mm.
was he brought in as a speaker. So I surmised from that, well, Cardinal Pell is probably not a communio groupie of any
Yeah,
kind.
he wasn't a communio groupie. And, I imagine if Cardinal Pell and David Schindler sat down together, Pell would just be saying, like, why are you talking about metaphysics? Like, um,
Well,
relation one.
maybe they're chatting now.
Maybe they're chatting now precisely. But Pell, Pell was an entrepreneur. He liked building things. He liked organizing things. So he got a hotel built in Rome for Australian pilgrims or anyone else who wants to stay there. But it's, a great hotel in Rome. He got World Youth Day to Sydney. He liked
Yeah.
big projects. He's more in the style of those early American cardinals who built, say, Mundelein Seminary, or
Yeah.
like he was into big projects. And I think if he wasn't a priest and wasn't a footballer, he would have been a politician who was into infrastructure. You know, that,
Yeah.
roads, airports, hospitals, that sort of thing. Whereas, yeah, trying to explain to him the difference between a communio perspective and a neocon perspective, and what's wrong with extrinsicist accounts of the relationship between nature and grace. No, no, no.
Yeah. Yeah.
If
There
they're
you
going
go.
to mass, they're saying their prayers, they're being faithful to their wives. That's all that's necessary, sort of. Who's more like that.
What strikes me in your description then, and I noticed this too, there is a pragmatic, practical side to the neocon perspective,
Mm,
that truly the communio perspective sort of disdains just a bit as just so much compromise, I don't know, accommodation.
mm,
But I remember once I was in a limo going to an airport, maybe in Rome or something, with once again with George Weigel, who was a famous neocon, and the name of David Schindler. This is before Schindler died, and Schindler came up, and Weigel knows I'm a communio guy, and so it was a respectful conversation. But he said, "You communio people, you're in your metaphysical fog, down there doing your metaphysical stuff. The rest of us have to be down in the trenches doing the hard work."
mm,
And you know, I think that Richard Newhouse, though, at first things he had a foot, I think, in both camps in some sense.
mm,
He was a very practical and pragmatic, but he was also a deeply intellectual theoretician. Uh, so in other words, I don't want to caricature the neocon position as this monolithic sort of pragmatic approach to things, but there's definitely
mm.
that element there, right?
Yeah, there is. And look, the way I understand things is sort of using a Lord of the Rings metaphor, that like we're in the battle for Middle Earth, and there are different people with different skill sets and different roles to play in the battle, you know.
Yeah.
And um, but I am someone who thinks that the distinction is important simply because I am strongly of the belief that extrinsicist constructions have caused the problem of secularization. And so I go to war against extrinsicism. And I do that simply because the way I look at things, that's been a big problem. But at the same time, I don't see myself as wanting to be in a war with the neocons,
Yeah.
um, because, in so many ways we are in agreement.
Yeah. One can say, and I'm glad we're having this conversation. I don't think it's a sidebar because I think it does pertain to Cardinal Pell, which I'll come back to. There's a sense in which, okay, let's bracket our differences with regard to nature and grace and the question of, extrinsicism, between nature and grace that leads to secularism. Let's bracket that because right now the church is in a crisis. Right now the church has bigger problems than
Mm.
battling extrinsicist notions of nature and
Yes.
grace.
Yeah.
And that bigger problem is a crisis of faith, as
Yeah.
Pope Benedict constantly pointed. And I knew you knew Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict as well. What was so along those lines in terms of
Mm.
pre-Francis, the crisis
Mm.
in the church, the falling away, the apostasy, the
Mm.
post-Vatican II rupturists being everywhere?
Mm.
What was Cardinal Pell's relationship with Pope Benedict? And did Cardinal Pell sort of share this concern about the falling away from the faith?
Oh, he absolutely shared the concern about the falling away from the faith. But I think in his mind, um, he was someone who really believed in magisterial authority, what Newman would call the Ecclesia Docens, the teaching authority of the Magisterium. And for Cardinal Pell, the fact that people just thumb their noses at Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae, for him, that's not a Catholic way to behave, and he understood that it came out in the 1960s and that the 1960s was an era of sexual revolution and the contraceptive pill had just come on the market. He was fully aware of all the cultural factors, but he also found the dissent just so inconsistent with a Catholic ecclesiology. So, for him, I think he would explain the dissent as like not understanding Catholic ecclesiology, not understanding what is required of a Catholic in terms of the role of the Petrine office, Whereas someone like Pope Benedict would say, "Oh well, we've had problems since the 14th century. We've got nominalism, and then we've got Protestantism, and then we've got the 18th century, and we've got the separation of faith and reason, and then the 19th century we've got a romantic reaction to that, and so on and so forth, and then we end up in the 1960s with the Frankfurt School." And their cultural Marxism. And so it's like there's been all of these moves on a chessboard that have been bad moves, And Benedict's approach was to try and teach people about the bad moves. So he was like an intellectual historian who would say things went wrong here, 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 here. To fix the problem, we've got to understand that these were the wrong moves and these were the right moves. Cardinal Pell was a different figure. He was more like, we're Catholics, we follow the Pope, and and so we want Catholic families. We don't want divorces. We don't want abortions. We don't want contraceptives, and we have a vision of the Catholic family. St. John Paul II has presented that vision so in such an articulate way. And we're going to get behind John Paul too. We're going to support him. We're going to be loyal. So he's like a football coach. We're on this team, and this is how we're going to behave, and we're going to win the battle with our loyalty.
Yeah.
That's one approach. And Benedict's like the Oxbridge professor who's like, oh, we've got all of these problems because all of these different intellectual moves have been made and they've all been bad and we've got to fix them. Look, I think there's room
Yes.
for both approaches and for many more approaches as well.
Yeah.
But that's the difference.
Yeah, and I think it's an important difference, and I think you're correct that a multiplicity of approaches, all within the ambit of orthodoxy, are not only allowed but necessary because we need all these different charisms and all these different kinds of voices. And yeah, Benedict was professorial, and
Hmm,
Cardinal Pell was like, "Let's get some things done. All right,
exactly.
let's get moving here." That being said, theologically, once again. In Principles of Catholic Theology, obviously you won the Ratzinger Prize. You know Ratzinger's thought better than anyone, just about. But in Principles of Catholic Theology, and reminiscing on Gaudium et Spes, Ratzinger says, I believe in 1980 or so, or 75, uh, that Gaudium et Spes represents an anti-syllabus of errors approach. Uh,
Mhm,
Not that the syllabus of errors was wrong, but on a prudential level, a more positive approach needs to be adopted, one that doesn't
mhm,
simply condemn, but gets at the roots of the errors and
mhm,
sort of builds off of those. And so
mhm,
uh, he's sort of non-committal with regard to whether or not that was a wise project to take on. Would
mhm,
Cardinal Pell have shared, in other words, Cardinal Pell doesn't strike me, based on your description, as somebody that simply, even though he was concerned with orthodoxy, with we just need to get back to Pius X and
mhm,
Pascendi and syllabus of errors. That doesn't seem to be his approach. But
mhm,
his approach also wasn't professorial. What, since he was a practical man, what was his sort of practical solution or his proposals for how the church should move forward out of this crisis? Do you know, or am I putting you on the spot
Well,
again?
he certainly, he put a lot of effort into Catholic education. And when he was the Archbishop of Sydney, he spent something like $800,000, almost $1 million Australian a year on university chaplaincy work because he wanted the students at the universities in Sydney to have a Catholic intellectual formation that would be commensurate with whatever they were learning at the university. So if they were studying, I don't know, aeronautical engineering at university, he thought that someone who was studying aeronautical engineering needed a presentation of the Catholic faith at an intellectual level which would satisfy their needs. So he put an enormous amount of money into Catholic education. He would invite speakers from all over the world to come to Australia to talk to young people. And his criteria was really just, are they Orthodox? You know?
Yeah.
And so he had sort of pretty much a broad church understanding of Orthodox. Um, so,
Yeah.
if someone
Not
was
a narrow vision, but a very
not a narrow,
a capacious understanding of the tradition.
yeah, very much so. Yeah. But he,
So,
he really thought we've got to educate our young people. Yeah.
well, that's good. I agree with that. And even though he wasn't a theologian's theologian or something, but he obviously had theological opinions,
Mm,
and I'm sure that he encouraged the staffing of the schools in Australia with good theological minds.
mm,
Now, the I want to come back. We're running up almost on an hour or so here, so we'll end soon. But I want to address the issue that you just raised about his approach to the Petrine ministry.
mm,
That, as Catholics, we need to give it the benefit of the doubt and be respectful and pay attention to magisterial teaching and its authority.
mm.
Um, but was it difficult for him? Did he have, given that, did he
Mm.
have to bite his tongue under the papacy
He
of
never
Pope
bit his
Francis?
tongue. My understanding is he never bit his tongue, and that he would always be quite open with Pope Francis about what he thought of trends under his pontificate. I, th- I, I think that Pope Francis had a kind of respect for him because I think he understood that Cardinal Pell was not a self-promoter and not one of these people who just wants to walk around in fine regalia. One story I heard was that during that 2013 conclave, until they actually had to be in certain regalia to go into the Sistine Chapel, Cardinal Pell was just getting around in very casual clothes. And, he could dress up if he thought the occasion required it, but wearing all the regalia just wasn't something that floated his boat. Building a new hospital floated his boat, but wearing the regalia and stuff didn't. So I think he had the respect of Pope Francis as an absolutely genuine person who wouldn't toady to the Pope, who would just say to the Pope, you know, um, I have a problem with this for these reasons.
Yeah.
And he certainly said in his very last that very last communique that was published in the Spectator a couple of
That's
days
what's
before his
leading me
death.
to ask this question.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he was quite clear. Like he thought the papacy of Francis had been a disaster because it had created so much uncertainty about what the church actually teaches. And I can remember somebody saying to him something like, oh, but Pope Francis cares about the poor and the marginalized. And Cardinal Pell's response was, yeah, he gets that. He really gets that. And that's genuine, He
Yeah.
he, he really gets that. Um, but the need for the person who occupies the chair of Peter to give unequivocal teaching was not was not something he seemed to appreciate. He seemed to behave more like a Jesuit general who, like I think you can sort of make sense of the papacy or his approach to the Petrine office if you think of him as behaving like a Jesuit general,
Yeah.
there's this faction, there's that faction. I'll get them to have a conversation. I'll try and get them talking to each other, and I won't lay down any hard and fast rules. We'll let this side experiment with their ideas and that side experiment with that ideas, and we'll see which ones seem to work better. And it's a
Yeah.
sort of very Jesuitical approach.
So those negative comments, though, about Pope Francis, where he says this papacy has been a disaster, they only
Mm.
came out posthumously, those comments, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So Cardinal Pell did not publish something that openly, brazenly, sort of brutally honest before he died.
He was working for it to be published. Yeah.
Oh, was he?
So
Okay.
he fully expected to be alive when those comments were published.
Well, that's a great piece of information because I'm not certain a lot of people realize that. Because
Mm.
what some friends of mine who are critics of Pell will say, well, yeah. I mean, traditionalist friends of mine too, who are critical of
Mm.
Pell, say, yeah, yeah, he said those things, but he never said them while he was still alive. It was after he died. So that's a nice piece of information to know that he fully expected those thoughts to be made public
Mm.
before he died. Before he died.
Mm. Mhm.
But this raises the question, and we'll sort of maybe end here. Cardinal Pell, therefore, his concept of obedience to the magisterium was
Mm.
not that Catholics must be slavishly subservient to the magisterium, but that especially prelates
Mm.
have a role to play with a sort of creative fidelity
Mhm.
where they can be critical of the
Yeah.
Pope now and then.
Yeah. I think with him too, he said, like he told me once that he just went into Pope Francis's office and after one of the synods on the family and said, okay, well, what position I took at the synod. Is there anything you want to say to me? Shall we
Yeah,
talk about this? And he said that Pope Francis sort of said, no, no, like you're entitled to your position and I understand your position. And um, he said
that's good.
it wasn't really like it wasn't as if Pope Francis thought he shouldn't have spoken
Right.
his mind at the synod. Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
And
that's
and so
very,
I think that in his understanding of the teaching magisterium, he saw a role for bishops. And if some crazy guy was making statements, contrary to 2,000 years of church teaching, from the perspective of Cardinal Pell, then, the other guys should say, hey, that's not what we believe. How did you get
yeah,
that idea? And how
yeah.
do you defend that idea? Um, and and so I guess, there's this criticism you've probably heard that under the pontificate of John Paul II, all the bishops just kind of cowered in the corner and let John Paul II take all the flack. It was like, oh, don't blame us. We've got this Polish Pope and he's very
Yeah.
strict, and there's nothing we can do about it. And so they kind of hid behind the authority of the Pope. Um, and it's almost as if now we're kind of entering a new phase where perhaps the bishops need to take seriously their role as being part of the teaching church and take responsibility for that.
Well, after all, I mean, that's ultimately what synodality means, if
Yeah,
it means
yeah,
anything at all.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's some sort of a permutation of collegiality
Mm.
out of Vatican II. Anyway, we're out of time, really. I don't want to. It's getting late for you there, but is there anything else you would like to add to the story of Cardinal Pell that we
To the
haven't
story of Cardinal
discussed?
Pell, well, look, I think. I'm not saying this to sell the book, but I do think that what you get in the book is like a kaleidoscope perspective. You get Cardinal Pell from 38 different perspectives. And I think that, just reading those memoirs, it's sort of heartening. Like it's a good feel book. People read it and
Yeah,
they feel like, oh yeah, like they can feel proud to be a Catholic. Um, they can see that this was a man who really took his priesthood seriously and, tried to help people where he could,
yeah.
and was also very, very human. So,
That's great. I'm glad we're ending in that regard because, I do want to promote your book. And I decided not to go into the particulars of 38 different points of view
mhm,
because we'd have been
mhm,
here for 5 hours. I decided to pick your brain about Cardinal Pell instead. Nevertheless, that's a great way to end. That if you're interested in Cardinal Pell and if Dr. Rowland has piqued that interest more, then by all means, buy this book so that you can get 38 other opinions of people who knew Cardinal Pell. And personally, I think he's one of the great prelates of our era.
mhm.
Sad he has passed, but the church moves on. The church moves on.
And
Well,
the church triumphant is with us.
that's true. Cardinal Pell is with us. David
Mm.
Schindler's with us, and so on. Oh,
Yeah.
well, thank you, Tracy, for being on the show today.
Okay. Yeah.
It's time for you to go to bed. It's time for
Time
me
for
to
me
go
to
get
go to
more
bed.
coffee. All right.
Okay.
Th-
All
okay.
right.
Thanks.
Take
Bye
care.
bye.
God bless,
You too.
Larry. Bye.
Bye.